Hi, everyone, all of the attendees. I wish I could see you, but Zoom webinar doesn't allow for it, but it's okay. At least we know you're there. Hello, and welcome to Columbia Science Review's Best Event Since Sliced Bread. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alli Greenberg, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel. I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers. Tonight we have Professor Megan Elias, who is the director of the Gastronomy program at Boston University. She is the author of 5 books about American food history and the editor of the journal Food, Culture, and Society. We also have Chef Francisco Migoya with us tonight. Chef Migoya is the head chef of the Modernist Cuisine Kitchen in Seattle and is the co-author of Modernist Bread. Modernist Bread is a 5-volume book which has won a variety of awards, including one from the James Beard Foundation. Together with his co-author Nathan Myhrvold, Chef Migoya directs culinary research and development of recipes and techniques. He has been recognized as a top US pastry chef and chocolatier. Chef Migoya owned Hudson Chocolates in New York and has previously worked as the executive pastry chef of the French Laundry and Bouchon Bakery. Prior to joining the Modernist Cuisine team, Chef Migoya was an instructor at the Culinary Institute of America, with areas of instruction being bread, pastry, and culinary science. And currently, Chef Migoya, Nathan Myhrvold, and the Modernist Cuisine team are conducting research and writing their next book called Modernist Pizza, which I'm super excited about because I love pizza. All pizza is good pizza. So before we begin, I just want to remind all the attendees that if you have any questions, write them in the Q&A box. There's a Q&A function in Zoom webinar where you can write your questions, and we will have time reserved at the end of the event for us to answer them. So now that that's been all sorted out, let's start. I'm super excited. This has been my brainchild. I'm so excited. So my first question is for Professor Elias. So obviously bread was not an American invention, but in what ways do American people misunderstand the importance of bread in American culture and in world history in general?
Yeah, so a couple of things I like to say about that. One is that bread isn't a staple food for everybody in the Americas. It never was. So even various groups of Europeans who came didn't all obsess about bread. But there's this idea that everybody eats bread, that if you have bread, you have food. And that's not the case for a lot of folks who settled in North America. Also that I think people underestimate the importance of the obsession with bread. So I like to say that Europeans came to America with a commitment to bread, and that commitment caused them to shape the landscape, to provide themselves with wheat to make bread. So they changed the face of the continent because of this obsession with wheat bread, and couldn't just let it go and eat whatever was in front of them. Used indigenous ingredients for other things and tried to sort of mold it into breads. But their commitment to that really changed all North, Central, and South America to some degree too. So I think that's really important, that it was a desire rather than a necessity, and yet it had this enormous impact on the ecology, really.
Mm-hmm. And then sort of as a follow-up question to that, there seems to be certain foods that move in and out of the human diet, but why has bread remained so important to some cultures rather than others?
Well, I think it's just so useful. I mean, that's kind of an obvious answer, but it was used as a utensil. So you can think of bread itself as a technology, that it was something that you could pick up other foods with, that it soaks them up, that the leftovers can be used for lots of other kinds of things too. So it is useful enough to bother with the work of making it, which, as Chef Migoya will talk about, right? It's no easy thing to make a bread. So it has to be, the benefit has to be worth the cost of time and fuel and arm strength to do it.
And then our next question is for Chef Migoya. What are the most basic scientific principles people need to know to understand bread making? Like, for example, what does someone absolutely need to know in order to make a sourdough? Like, it doesn't have to be a successful sourdough at first, but like, what do they have to, I know when I've made it, the first attempt was not the best. But
Yeah, it's a great question because there's a lot of fear around. I mean, it's not like fear as in you fear for your life, but there's a worry that it's not going to turn out right. So there's a few steps that you can take to simplify the process. The first is I always recommend people get a scale to weigh their ingredients, which is always preferable over volume because this is going to give you accuracy. The second is that when you start a starter, so to speak, what you're doing is you're basically combining flour and water, right? That flour contains everything you need for the sourdough starter to get going. It contains all the yeast, it contains all the lactic acid bacteria that you're going to need to create that, that environment that is going to eventually ferment and produce your bread. So the first thing is combining your water and flour. Don't get too hung up on the water. There's a lot of again, there's a lot of myths around the water and what type of water you use, and including you guys in New York, you have a thing with your water, like that is, it's
the best water.
we'll talk about that later if you'd like. But the point is that as long as it's water that you would drink, it's fine to use for bread. So you combine water and flour, and the next thing you have to do is be patient. Because that fermentation is going to take time. But I would also recommend keeping it in area where it's not too hot or not too cold. It's like any living thing, it's going to lack a consistency in that temperature. So a temperature that you're comfortable in, it will also be comfortable, right? Once you start to see some activity, that's going to be in the form of bubbles. That's basically the CO2 that the yeast is producing. Once you start to see that, it will be after the third, fourth, maybe fifth day. Then you can start doing what is calling either feeding it or perpetuating it, meaning it's starting to eat the sugars that are in the flour, because flour is mostly sugar. And then it's going to run out of food. So what your job is to do is to provide it with food. So you need to provide it with food on a consistent basis as well. It's like any living thing. It'll get used to a cycle of feeding. So the second thing I would recommend is feeding it more or less at the same time every day, if you can. It doesn't have to be on the nose. It can be like 1 hour after or before, but it's such an adaptable organism that it'll know how much resources it has for X amount of time, and it'll use them up. But if it uses them up and it doesn't have enough to replenish, then your sourdough starter is going to start to die. Okay, so I would say if you make it a habit of, you're making yourself dinner, feed your starter too. So you're feeding everybody basically. If you turn it into that sort of habit, then your starter is going to have a longer lifespan. But temperature fluctuations and feeding fluctuations are really going to negatively affect it. So.
Mm-hmm. And then as a follow-up question to that, what are some of the more complicated scientific underpinnings of bread making that people do not know about, but are fundamental in making a loaf of bread? We can use sourdough as an example again.
Yeah, one of the very interesting ways to understand bread is that bread is dough is a foam and bread is a set foam. It's a very clinical way to look at it, but it's also a very important way to look at it because at the end of the day, it's a bubble system, right? It's interconnected bubbles that once heat is applied to them, it's going to set. It's going to gelatinize, right? But something that is very important to understand too is that if your sourdough, we're talking about sourdough, it's going to have a very unique personality. Everybody's sourdough starter is going to have its own unique personality, and it's something important for everybody to understand. If you're gifting somebody or somebody gifts you their sourdough, it might be the same for a few days, but eventually it's going to evolve. It's going to evolve into something else. So there's a lot of nostalgia for sourdough starters that have been passed down through generations, and the truth is that very little, if anything, is left of that original starter when you have it. So if it dies on you, or if it just is getting sluggish on you, don't get mortified, because the truth is that nothing of its origins are in it anymore. And so those are important things to realize, but also you can control the flavor of your sourdough. And you can control it by what temperature you keep it at, right? Because what makes every sourdough starter unique is the mix of lactic acid bacteria that may be in the sourdough. Everyone has a different one. While they may have the same yeast, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's the dominant yeast, the lactic acid bacteria is what is so different because there are many different species of lactic acid bacteria. And so there are certain lactic acid bacteria that thrive in colder environments that produce very acidy sourdoughs, like very vinegary sourdoughs. And there are certain lactic acid bacteria that prefer warmer temperatures. And then those produce the more like dairy, like yogurty sort of flavors in your sourdough starter. So you can manage what the outcome is of the flavor that you want based on what temperature you keep your starter at. And so, you know, I'm not a fan of a very intense sourdough starters. So, and what I try to do is I try to keep mine at around 60, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. I actually keep mine in a wine fridge, which it's something that I can regulate the temperature to, because the refrigerator is too cold and for me room temperature is too warm. So in a wine fridge, I make some room and I keep my starter in there, and it produces the flavor that I want. So so there's many of the things that you're in control of, and it really is, it's a living thing that you can control the outcome of.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful, because now I understand where I went wrong in a couple of places. My fridge is way too cold, probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good place to store it for a few days, but eventually when you start to see the film of water on top, there's very little chance of it coming back to life. What happens is a lot of people, like, what they do is they'll take it out and then they start feeding it again. And then 3 or 4 days it comes back, but it's not really coming back, because that's almost like a zombie coming back to life. It doesn't really, what you're really doing is you're starting practically a brand new starter at that point. So, you know, yeast can be dormant, but it's not, there are very few cells that are left over that can do anything in there. So better than keeping it in your fridge, what we recommend doing is dehydrating it completely, at very low temperature, pulverizing it, and then you can keep it in your fridge for as long as you want, and you revive it. It's very easy to revive with a little bit of water. But when you see that you know, film of water on top, it's not a very good sign.
Right. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And now for Professor Elias, another question. Is there a specific bread recipe that you think has an interesting history behind it? If so, do you know, like, where it originated from, which people were making it? Is it still eaten today? Those kind of questions.
Yeah, I had one in mind, which I will talk about in a minute, but I just wanted to think about too what Chef Migoya is saying about the bread as a living organism that people take care of, and to put that also into context with sort of the long history of domestic production, and to think of, you know, a woman in the household responsible for her bread, right, for keeping her starter going, and also at the same time responsible for her kids who are running around, responsible for the chickens in the yard, responsible also for the cow and the dairy. And so that to also to think about bread as a living thing, as part of responsibilities that's a woman typically would have for a lot of living things around her. So again, to think of it as almost part of the like livestock, right? You know, you've got your cow because it keeps producing milk. You've got your starter because it keeps producing bread. And so the cow and the starter are almost like cousins in the same family. But the bread recipe that I think is particularly interesting is called Cornell bread. And it was invented in the 1930s, and really invented, it was engineered at Cornell by a scientist, Clive McKay, who was actually really interested in pet food, but took a turn to think about human food for a little while. And he came up with this bread that was supposed to be the most nutritious bread possible, because the time that he was living in was a time of hunger, right, the Great Depression. And so he wanted to come up with something that could nourish people who had nothing else. And again, that's based in this idea that's very culturally specific. Oh, they have nothing, but bread, right? If they have nothing, at least they'll have a loaf of bread. Let's make that loaf of bread the best it can be. And so it has soy flour and it has corn and it has a couple of other flours that I'm now blanking on. The recipe is still around. People still occasionally make it, but it's not very trendy. It's not very complicated, right? And it was partly designed to be something people could make easily. Kind of not, Clive McKay was not entirely in touch with the people he was thinking about. And then it takes a lot of different flours, which if you have no money and you have no stove and you have, if you're living out of the back of your car, it's probably going to be pretty hard to get all of those materials together and make this perfect bread. But I like to think about it. It's one of these foods that's good to think with because it represents so many ideas about society at the same time. And it is actually tasty. So McKay was interested in making something that people would want to eat rather than just some sort of nutrition pill, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never heard of that recipe before on it because I probably haven't, it's probably not in like any of the cookbooks I have on my shelf or
it is definitely
like
not. Yeah, it's utility food. It's something that you make and you keep and you just eat, but you don't think about it very much. I mean, McKay thought about it a lot, right? He worked it out in a lab and he tried it out on a lot of people. And the nutritionists at Cornell, it was like their kind of poster food, right? This is what it represented their work.
Mm-hmm. And then another question, which is kind of related to your response to Chef Migoya's explanation of the science and treating bread kind of as like a human being, a living thing. In what ways is the history of bread tied to issues of economics, race, and class that people should know about before they bake or buy their next loaf in the grocery store that usually go unnoticed?
Oh my goodness, so many ways. Yeah. So some of the things I like to think about with bread are the fact that it was often, and I'm talking like back before the mid 19th century, it would have been made in America often collectively. So because fuel is really expensive, it would not, and because having a nice big bread oven is not possible for most people back then, even as it is today, you might make your dough and then take it to the local baker and pay the local baker a little bit of money to bake it in his oven. And the baker was a man. And other women would be doing the same thing. So the bakery then becomes a kind of a hangout place where women can chat to each other while they're waiting for the bread to bake. Or you might take your dough over to your friend's house and bake together so that you can maximize the fuel, right? You just have to put in the fuel at that one particular time to bake together. And again, that's a social occasion. So it's like the book club of today. It's a reason to get together, but you're not necessarily going to be talking about the bread while you're baking it. So I'm sort of like an advocate for community ovens. I would love to see people build those in every neighborhood so that we could all run down with our dough and have a chat while we're cooking. And I also, I think those big bread ovens are probably a lot better than the dinky one in my kitchen. Other things that are really interesting about bread and class is the idea that, like this event is called the best event since sliced bread, right? The idea that sliced bread is some kind of abomination that we kind of have now, like, oh, it's got no soul and it's all square and it's usually white and blah. In the moment that it was invented, it really was an amazing thing because it meant that a housewife didn't have to worry about the starter. That was time that she could have for herself, right? She was no longer responsible for that organism. She could spend time with other organisms. And the importance of slicedness is that you can tell exactly how many sandwiches you're going to be able to make. So if you have a lovely sourdough, like I'm just learning how to make, it's delicious, but I don't know how many sandwiches it's going to make. So if I have a large family that I have to send off to school, it's no use to me, where the sliced bread is perfect. So it's this brilliant idea that now just seems like, it's so ordinary and it isn't tasty and exciting. And then the third thing I think about with bread is the history of what are called hot breads in the in the South. So the idea that at every meal you could have hot bread with your meal. That was after the Civil War, before the Civil War and after the Civil War, that was part of this legend of Southern hospitality, that you would never eat cold bread, that only those Yankees in the North put cold bread in their mouths. And that idea that you always have fresh hot bread, and by bread, we don't mean yeast risen, we basically mean biscuits, muffins, things called gems, which were like a kind of, almost like a flat sort of muffin creature. Those things were possible because of unfree labor. So the whole idea of, oh, you can have hot bread in every meal only is possible if you have unfree labor, people constantly baking in the kitchen. This is true especially for biscuits. There's a whole kind of cult of the biscuit, that the biscuits have to be beaten for an hour with an axe handle to have. And that, so that whole was based when you're kids, or mindful, I should say.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I didn't realize I was muted for a second, but I really appreciate that. I always look at the loaf of bread I buy and I don't really understand much of the history behind it. So I'm really glad that I know a little bit more about it. But before I move on to my next question for Chef Migoya, do you have any response to that as well? Like what have you found in your studies of bread history as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think an important thing about the loaf of bread that you see at the grocery store that is so maligned, we asked for it. I mean, that is something that we asked for, and industry provided. You want a loaf of bread that is cheap, that is going to last for many days, and is going to be sustenance. And so industry always reacts to whatever is needed, and it fills that need. So I also feel like it's, it has its place. I mean, I can't think of a BLT with sourdough bread. I mean, it'll be fine, right? I mean, it's okay to have a BLT or like a hamburger bun. Do I want a sourdough hamburger bun? Or do I just want like the Martin's potato bun or something like that for a hamburger? And so I think everything has its place. And so it's interesting because a lot of people want to talk about sourdough, but what Professor Elias is saying is very interesting too. It's like you have to look at it beyond how we look at bread now and how we understand it now to appreciate what it was, what it is, and what it will be. I mean, there's for something that is apparently so simple, it's extremely complex, not just in and of itself, but how it has affected history, human history throughout its inception. So. You're on mute.
Oh, I keep forgetting. Thank you. I really appreciate that response. And then for our next question, what was your favorite and least favorite experiment to do over the course of writing Modernist bread? Like, did one recipe prove extremely difficult over the other, or like, did you enjoy making all of this bread for so long that it just became?
So I think that there are certain breads that you can develop an affinity towards for many different reasons that are beyond flavor. Like for example, the two breads that are hands down the most complex breads to execute in our book are a baguette and the panettone. And for many different reasons, right? A baguette it was actually developed to, it was a bread that was made to be easy to make and replicate and make hundreds of. The hard part is actually getting that shape right and getting the cuts on the surface right and making them all consistent in size. So that is extremely challenging. And panettone is also extremely challenging too. I mean, I think that it's very important to have a good panettone to understand what I'm saying. If you buy the panettone that was shipped from Italy and it's been sitting in a grocery store for 2 months, it's not even remotely going to be good. It is a bread dough that defies everything that you know about dough, like how much sugar it can take, how much butter it can take, how long it takes to mix. And to get it right, that takes a lot of practice. And I have people who buy the book and the first thing they want to do is panettone. I'm like, you kind of have to graduate to panettone. It's like, keep it simple first, and then you can graduate to panettone. And so as far as experiments go, we performed 1,500 experiments for this book. And I will tell you, if you think about 1,500 experiments and what that means, it means that you could do experiments for 3 years in a row, a different experiment every day. And so the challenge with that is keeping those experiments organized, keeping them, keeping up with them, knowing when to give up on some of them, because sometimes you just hit a wall and you can't move forward. And some experiments are literally take a day, some take 6 months. If you're doing an experiment on freezing bread and how long it takes to freeze bread and how that affects the dough and so on and so forth. So I think my least favorite one was experiments that we did with whole wheat flour. And the experiments were to see how much bran and germ we could put into a dough. It was basically to do an experiment to see how weight affected the volume increase of dough. And we used bran and germ for that. Just tasting that bread, I still think about just that, every day was just like eating sawdust every day. Because we had to taste it too, because beyond doing the experiments on bread that we used machinery to measure results, we also did sensory evaluation tests with it. And so we had to, because we have to give a personal opinion on whether the bread is good or not. But I mean, it's very subjective, and there's a whole thing we can talk about with sensory science. But at the end, if it doesn't taste good, it is not worth putting in the book. And so I think that those would probably be my least favorite ones. We call them payload experiments, right? It's how much payload can the bread take before it just loses its volume. So.
That's very interesting. I'm not always a fan of whole wheat breads, and I think it's, to a certain extent, it has to do with the flavor for me. I don't know why, but that's interesting to hear that was the hardest one.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people feel the same way, and they feel shamed into having to eat whole wheat breads, right? I mean, and something that is very important to mention is that whole wheat is not necessarily healthier for you. It's not. We have a whole section in our book that discusses that whole there's a lot of information that is not exactly accurate as to what nutrition-wise whole wheat contributes. In fact, a lot of science says that it actually takes away, because bran and germ, I don't want to get too visual as to what it is, but it doesn't contribute nutrients. It takes, on its way through you, it will take a lot of things away, including nutrients. So it does not contribute nutrition significantly. And if you prefer to eat white flour bread, go ahead, by all means, eat white flour bread, and don't let anybody shame you into eating whole wheat bread.
Thank you for that. I'm sure people need to hear it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned panettone. So my family is Italian and Jewish. So every holiday season, we have a panettone and we have challah, and those are the breads we exclusively eat. So with the holidays coming up, what is one bread recipe you think people should try and make for their families?
It really depends on what you like, but I really like stollen very much, because stollen can also, in fact, the more it ages, the better it tastes. And that's what happens with a lot of breads that have to be consumed within a few days, right? But stollen is something that you can make many of, and as it ages, it actually becomes better. So that's one of my favorite breads, the holiday breads to make. Panettone, yes, of course. I mean, that's hands down, but I think it with a little bit more ease would be to think about doing a stollen bread. So
Interesting. I'll look up a recipe. I'll see what I can find.
Here, there's a really good book about bread that has that recipe in it.
Modernist bread, please.
Yes.
Mom and dad, Christmas present. if you can find
Everybody will benefit from that. So.
And then I guess my last.
Your parents are saying, "We got you." There you go.
Barb in the chat. But I guess my last question for Professor Elias is that on the topic of science in food, molecular gastronomy is a relatively young field and has become extremely popular. Do you think molecular gastronomy has influenced the ways in which people will approach bread making into the future?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think it will. Oh, I'm probably going to freeze here. Sorry, my internet's not great.
Okay.
It will. It's affecting how people think about food in general, and I think it's part of a kind of a larger trend in thinking about cooking and domestic life more generally. A kind of two things, like a masculinization, men getting involved, and an intellectualization, and those two things really go hand in hand. That for generations, cooking and bread making were thought of as just women's stuff, not brain stuff. Because of some cultural shifts, starting in the 1960s, people began to think of cooking as, people in America, I should say, began to think of cooking as an intellectual and kind of artistic endeavor. And at that point, it kind of becomes okay for professional people. And in the 60s and 70s, most of your professional people are men, for people like that to get involved and to get interested. And then we start to see manufacturers of devices getting involved in making things for the kitchen that will appeal to characters who have been socialized to think of themselves as scientific, typically men, right? So this idea that you're doing something cool in the kitchen is a relatively new idea. And it's pretty exciting because it gets more people into the kitchen. And the more people who are in the kitchen, the more the labor is shared, which for me is the most important thing, right? The labor is shared, the pleasure is shared too, right? When men were not involved in household cooking, they missed out on all of that fun too. So the two things I think are happening, that we're thinking about domestic labor as something that requires intellect, which it always did, right? But now people are beginning to see it. And in part because of gadgets, in part because of the application of, or I shouldn't say the application of scientific language, the revelation that this was science all along, right? That thing the lady had in her bowl, that was a science experiment. It wasn't just bread. So yeah, I feel quite hopeful about it.
That's really interesting. I really enjoyed that because, yeah, I know, like, when I was younger, I wanted to be a chef before I wanted to be anything else, but I called them experiments. Like, I didn't say it was like a recipe. I said it was an experiment that everyone had to try. So that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. And then for Chef Migoya, why do you think it's important for chefs and home cooks to understand the scientific processes behind bread making or just making a dish in general?
I think because knowing what's going on will help you prevent most of the mistakes that can occur. I think that having that, just even a basic understanding of how things work and ingredient functionality and I'm not saying like getting really deep into it, but just having a basic on the surface understanding helps reduce errors in cooking, which will help reduce waste because sometimes it's something not edible. And I think that it can also help you, like if you've been doing something a certain way your entire life, you can start thinking of, maybe there's a better way to do it. And there's always a better way to do things. Always. I'm so surprised. For me personally, it's been, since I started, there's a dough that's called pâte à choux to make eclairs. I've gone through maybe 5 different versions of how I make it. And every time I'm like, no, this is the best. This is absolutely the best. And then I learn something else and I'm like, okay, let me try it out. And then it comes out better and so on and so forth. And that occurs at home too. Like, how do you make a steak juicier? How do I keep my chicken from overcooking? What things can I do to make a more delicious meal? And it's all pretty simple and it's all within reach. I think that a lot of the tools that people are afraid to use are actually very economical. A thermometer is $15, $20 and it'll get you to the point where you're cooking everything to the point where it's supposed to be cooked at and you're not going over or under. And I think it's also important for something that maybe doesn't happen very much, but it's for sanitation, right? I mean, there's things that people do at home that when I see it, it screams at me like you're gonna get sick if you keep putting that raw chicken in your sink and, you know, and not bleaching the sink after that. Just things like that that are easily preventable. And I don't think it requires too much thought to get to that point. And I think that to answer your question is to make better food at home, for sure.
And then now I have questions for both of you, so feel free to answer however you like. So the first question is, we kind of talked about nutrition and bread through one of your experiments, but how do you feel about the introduction of gluten-free bread products into popular culture, specifically in the United States? And what could this mean for the history of bread and of bread making? Like, will every bakery now have its standard gluten-free loaf, or will people shy away from it? Will people move towards it?
Well, so if you look at Google Trends and we did this, we looked at Google Trends from the period of 2004 to 2018, and we were tracking on gluten intolerance and celiac disease as two separate terms, where celiac disease has stayed it's been a constant number of hit searches every year by year. It hasn't gone up or down. Gluten intolerance has, from 2004 on, has just like gone skyrocketed. And after, I think about 2016 or 2017, it started to go down, okay? So it's all, a lot of this is trend-based, meaning people start to hear gluten's bad for you. It comes out somewhere, and then everybody starts to panic that gluten is the enemy. And even people not knowing what it is, they're still like, they avoid gluten. But there is, I mean, celiac disease is real. People, I mean, that's not imaginary. That definitely, we need to make food for those people that can be equally as good as normal bread. But I think it's here to stay. I don't think it's gonna go anywhere. I think that something very interesting about gluten-free breads is that they fly in the face of everything that is like organic and you know, clean label and so on and so forth, because in order for you to be able to replicate a bread that is going to be gluten-free and have the characteristics of a regular bread, you have to put a lot of stuff in there. You have to put a lot of stuff in there, and you have to use like 6 different types of flours to get a mix that is going to resemble wheat flour. So it's a very interesting contradiction between the world of people wanting gluten-free and people wanting clean label breads. So I think we're getting better and better at making gluten-free breads. I mean, I still have, the closest that we've gotten is we made a brioche recipe, a gluten-free brioche recipe, that if I didn't tell you it was gluten-free, you wouldn't be able to tell. But that's because there's so much butter in brioche, and it has that, you know, richness and that mouthfeel. But if I made a sourdough bread that was completely gluten-free, I don't think it hasn't been invented yet, one that is like going to fool somebody like me, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's basically, that's where we are. Eventually we'll be, you know, afraid of another ingredient, and, you know, maybe we'll forget about being afraid about gluten, but yeah, I mean, I think it's here to stay, and there's a lot of bakeries that offer it now, even though I mean, if it's going to be truly gluten-free, it has to be made in a gluten-free environment, and never come in contact with any flour at any point. And if it's in your bakery, that can almost be a problem because there's flour in the air. So I don't know, there's many parts to it that still people need to educate themselves and understand better as to what is gluten-free and what it requires to be completely gluten-free.
Mm-hmm. Professor Elias, do you have any view on gluten-free breads?
Yeah, for me, what's interesting about it, I mean, there's on the one hand, there's the new good knowledge about what celiac is and how to protect people from getting outbreaks, which is great. But then it's a kind of a replay of this commitment to bread, the idea that bread is, you have to have bread no matter what. So we'll make it out of whatever we can make it out of. This facsimile of bread, kind of, because it's an experience that has to be had. And of course it doesn't. right? There are 10 million other things to eat. And if you don't want gluten, there's a whole world of food to eat. There are many cultures that don't engage with gluten at all, that bread is not important to them. But the cultural significance of bread comes through in this desire to find the, the brioche that doesn't have gluten in it. Whereas, bread is, the idea is, well, not idea, the thing is about gluten often. So for me, it's really interesting that way, that it reaffirms this idea that bread matters socially, that it has some kind of cultural capital.
Thank you. And then another question that I have is that one of the more troubling issues in the world right now, outside of COVID-19, is climate change. And with wheat being a crop, in many places it's a plant, how do you see bread making being impacted by the rise in global temperatures worldwide? Like, will kind of alternative flours have to be used at a certain point if the crop can no longer exist?
Well, we still haven't heard anything about wheat crops being seriously affected by climate change yet. I guess the good news is that wheat benefits from either very cold winters or very hot summers. Well, depending on what kind of wheat you want, but the strong wheat flour that we get here in the United States and that is exported to Europe, it's typically grown in areas that are very cold. Those really cold temperatures produce a harder grain, which produces a harder flour, it's not very common in Europe to have very strong flours. And so a lot of it is exported from either the United States or Canada, sometimes from Russia into Europe. So far, like I said, there hasn't been an alarm going off yet for any sort of issues with wheat that I know of. I mean, it's something that is, there's agronomists that understand it so well and they know how to grow it so well that it hasn't become a problem yet. So I don't see it being a problem. I think there's other issues with like sourcing like commercial yeast that could be because of demand and so forth, possibly sugar and so forth. But it doesn't matter tremendously in the realm of artisan breads, but perhaps there'll be more problems with ingredients that have to be procured from tropical climates, which may not be tropical for very long, or be more temperate than they are right now. So.
Mm-hmm. Professor Elias, what do you think about climate change and its effect on how bread making might be in the future?
Well, I think I have sort of a roundabout answer, which is that climate change is going to cause migration, right? Which is going to bring together cultures that haven't necessarily been together, and that they will share culinary traditions. And it may be that bread loses its importance as people begin to eat with their neighbors in these kind of intense migrations north typically. But yeah, I haven't heard that there's any effect on wheat yet.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm just like, I've been thinking about it recently. It's just like it's because, like we talked about, bread has kind of become like this normalized thing in America that you can just find on a shelf. And then with COVID happening, there are like bread shortages, yeast shortages, all of that stuff. I'm just wondering how the climate will probably, if it will it affect the future of bread making? And then for the last question before we move on to our Q&A is, with people wanting to know more about the science behind bread, do you think there will be more scientists who become bread makers or bread makers who will become scientists?
There are a lot of scientists in the world of bread making. I mean, I think one of the things that really we tapped into was the fact that there's a lot of research that has gone into wheat and making dough, because it's a product that has been made in industrial production for many decades. So these are companies that can afford these sorts of research that needs to take place, that it might cost a lot of money. And so the scientists that do this research, they publish papers, and it's, you know, whether they're read or not is a different story, but we did a lot of the legwork that we did was trying to find these papers and see what of that information could be applied for normal, like at-home bread production or even artisan bread production. And it turns out that a lot of it can be adapted into the world of non-commercial baking. You know, that example I gave you about using pineapple juice, and we were talking about, nobody heard this except for us, talking about, you know, making challah and adding a little bit of pineapple juice to relax the gluten. I mean, this is something that industrial production of bread has known for the longest time. They don't use pineapple juice. They use more purified enzymes to use in their products. But those enzymes come from natural sources or unpurified sources, such as pineapple juice or kiwi or what have you. So it's, a lot of it has to do with doing that sort of research and seeing how you can take that information and move forward. So I think I don't know that a lot of scientists will become bread bakers or bread bakers will become scientists, but I think that a lot of bread bakers have more information available now as to how to make bread and what's happening and how to improve it now than they did even 10 years ago. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think more scientists will become bread bakers because more people will become bread bakers, because cooking has become much more of an entertainment and kind of, you know, an activity for more people. So it will happen. And I think, you know, there's also an opportunity for people to become kind of comfortable with thinking scientifically and thinking about the scientific method is not something that just happens in a lab, but happens in your kitchen with your friends, with your grandma. And then that also could be a good thing, that people think of science as part of life instead of just something often that building at the end of campus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your responses to those questions. Now we have lots of questions in the Q&A. So I'll try my best to get to all of them within the time. Maybe we'll go a little bit over. Is that okay with both of you guys? If we go a little bit over time? Awesome.
With me, it's fine.
So this question is for Chef Migoya from Melody. She says, I'm a chef that travels a lot, but not being home to feed a starter has stopped me from even having a starter at all. Any tips that may work for someone who can't be there to feed daily, or is all hope lost?
No, there's a few things you can do. So the first is, if you know you're going to be gone for, let's say, 3 or 4 days, what we recommend is feed it and then put it in your fridge, and it'll be fine by the time you come back. It's the long term in the fridge that is going to be a problem, right? Anything over like a week, 10 days, that's going to be a problem. The other thing you can do is, instead of, typically when you feed a sourdough starter, it's more or less equal parts water and flour. What you can do is reduce the amount of water, and the less water it has, the less yeast activity you're going to have. So if you make it stiffer, it's going to have a longer time to ferment. It's going to take it longer to ferment. Additionally, you can add a little bit of salt to that, because salt reduces yeast activity. It slows it down. It doesn't stop it, but slows it down. So if you add about 1% of the weight of your flour in salt, and you reduce the water to about 60%, what you're going to have is a firm dough that you can get 2 weeks in the fridge easily without a problem. That's when we go on Christmas break here. That's what we do. We go from a liquid starter to a stiff starter with salt. And when we come back, we just revive it with more water, and you know, we bring it back to life like that. If it's really long term, what you can do is, what I recommend is air drying it, or drying it in a dehydrator at very low temperature. You spread it very, very thin, like almost like you're spreading butter on toast, and then you dehydrate it. And once it's dry, you grind it with a spice grinder. I put it in a zip top bag, and I just keep it in my fridge. And then when I need it, I just add water to it, warm water to it, and in a day or two, it comes back to life. So there's ways of keeping it alive without letting it die. In Sweden, there's a thing called the sourdough hotel, which is, it's for people who care for their sourdoughs enough to take it to this place, to have it fed, and then when they come back from their vacation, Like it's like nothing happened. It's a wonderful concept. If you could get it, I bet it would work in Brooklyn, Professor Elias, right? Like that would be sustainable enough in a place like Brooklyn. Not to stereotype, but I'm sure there's enough people in Brooklyn that would patronize a sourdough hotel.
Thank you. And then Andrew has another question for Chef Migoya. Lots of people boast about the age of their sourdough starter. Did you do any studies to find out if there's a plateau at which the starter stops developing flavor?
Well, those are two separate questions. So it stops developing flavor when there's no activity, meaning when the yeast has been spent, because yeast dies. It dies when it starves. And so once it starves, it's not going to, basically there's not going to be any activity. But there is a lot of people that boast about the age of their sourdough starter. And that's, unfortunately, that is an enormous myth that it breaks a lot of people's hearts, because they're like, oh, but this was from my grandmother, or this was from, whoever gave it to me said it was like 100 years old. A sourdough is going to change the moment it changes rooms. Like in this lab, if I go to a lab across the hall and I keep my sourdough starter there, it's going to change in a few days because of whatever is in that environment is going to affect the sourdough starter. Additionally, it would assume that you're feeding it the same flour for 100 years or however long. That is impossible. I mean, I'm sure it could be possible, but think of the effort it would take to feed that sourdough starter the same flour from the same region every day for 100 years. That is virtually impossible. So it doesn't hold much water, so to speak, when somebody's posting about the age. It doesn't improve with flavor. You can make a perfectly good sourdough with a 2-month-old sourdough starter. It's not like wine. So that's something that it's important to understand. Don't feel like you have an inferiority complex if your sourdough starter is only a month old. It doesn't matter. It's fine. It'll make a pretty good loaf of bread. It doesn't have to be years old to make better bread.
Thank you. And then a question for both of you. Someone asks, would you say that gluten-free products are not as healthy in general? Like an example being a gluten-free bread loaf in a supermarket.
Professor Elias, you want to?
I have no idea. That is definitely not my field.
Okay. Well, that assumes that gluten is not healthy. I mean, that it assumes that regular bread, I mean, eating bread for health is a slippery slope, right? I mean, bread is not something that it's not a staple of our daily meals that we have to eat for sustenance now anymore. I mean, it used to be something that it was probably the only thing you ate, or you got paid in it, or you spent a good amount of your salary in bread. We don't have to do that anymore. We eat bread now because we enjoy it. And we either eat it, I could go days without eating bread, right? So it's not like this staple. So gluten-free bread is not necessarily going to be less nutritious. I mean, you're still eating starches. They're different starches. So there's going to be that, starches do have an effect on, your diet, depending on how much you eat of it. And so I think that the most important thing is that to not describe one as healthier than the other. They're different, and anything in moderation is fine. It's when you start the excess of consuming anything that it's going to be a problem on your health.
Thank you. And then this can be a question for both of you again. Are there cultural differences in appreciation for bread around the world?
I want to let Professor Elias speak because I feel like I've been...
Well, I mean, there are different, there are obviously different kinds of bread around the world. But I think everybody loves their own bread, right? So you definitely, I come across references in the 1920s, 1930s for people who are, visiting America from Europe, and they say, oh my God, the stuff they call bread, it's disgusting. And it just wasn't their bread, right? So it is, interestingly, for people for whom bread is part of their culture, they really care about it's nature, right? That it can be wrong or right, whereas a potato less so, right? A potato is just, you know, it doesn't have that. It doesn't speak of your nationality as much, and your understanding of what is the right way to do something and the wrong way to do something. So I don't think some people like, you know, if you have bread in your culture, you like your bread a lot. It's what I've seen so far in the record.
And never is that more true than with pizza. Holy cow. People ask me, what's your favorite pizza? And I like many styles, but when we traveled to Naples or we traveled to Buenos Aires or wherever we went, every place is like, no, our pizza is the best pizza. And the people who live there, they'll be like, I don't need any other kind of pizza. Only this can be called pizza. And so there's a lot of that like sense of like almost like sports and your team. And it's the same with bread. It's like, this is, you know, I only eat, you know, sourdough. I only, you know, whatever it may be. There is a lot of that, like, it's almost a sense of pride that identifies where you're from. And that's the bread you eat and that's the pizza you have, so.
And I think in part that's why people get so obsessed with their sourdough and its provenance, right, and its heritage, because again, it's a living thing in their household, so it becomes sort of part of who they are, right? If they want to believe that it's their granny's sourdough, it puts them in touch with her in a way, you know, and it helps them cook with someone who may not be living anymore. So it has a way of keeping you in touch with who you think your people are. That's really powerful.
Thank you. And then another question we have is from Frank and Eve. They ask, how do you feel about machine bread making? Is it less than traditional bread making? And how did the professionals like to feel about the bread machine?
So again, I think that one of the biggest, most important things that, from our approach is to never look at anything down. Like, I think that if you're going to make bread in a bread machine, at least you're making bread. You know, I think that I think what a lot of people like about it is that they can just put the ingredients in at night and they wake up and it smells like bread because there's a fresh loaf of bread coming out of the machine. So there's a lot of problems with that machine, meaning it doesn't knead the dough very well, so you don't get a lot of dough development. So meaning the machine itself doesn't have the ability to become very strong in the machine. So you're going to have a bread that is going to be it's going to have a very short texture. But at the end of the day, if you have warm bread, there's worse things I can think of to have than a piece of warm bread. And so it's not artisan by any means, and it's fallen out of favor too for a while. I think this was big in the 80s and 90s when people were getting like, people started to get these appliances to make bread. And maybe they're sitting collecting dust somewhere now, but they're not as popular now as they were back in the 80s.
No, I think, you know, historically they're a really interesting turn between the mass-produced bread and the artisanal homemade bread. So you can feel like you made it at home, but it still has that standardized, quality to it. So it's got this predictability, which is what you would get from the supermarket shelf, but you did it yourself. So you get to have that feeling too. So I think they're really interesting as objects, but they're also really big. And I think they just, and that consistency is like, yeah, it's pretty much always kind of the same flavor. So I can see why they were really exciting and why the excitement kind of paled pretty quickly too. You could just get a bread scented candle perhaps.
Sure.
And then our penultimate question, any tips for making a baguette, Chef Migoya?
Well, yes. You're not going to like the answer. The answer is you have to practice. and that, a lot of people don't like to hear that. It's like, you mean I have to get good at something, I have to do it a lot? Yes. And that is more true with baguette than with many breads, because the idea of how you shape it, meaning when you give it form, you have to give it form, but you also have to create a tension within the dough. And that tension is what's going to help it expand and create that nice crumb structure inside. So And that tension is also going to get, you know, when you cut the baguette and it gets that, it's called a score. When you get those cuts and they have like that sharp edge, that is only something you can achieve if you know how to shape the dough and if you know how to cut it. So those, it takes a lot of practice to get to that point where you're making, you know, dozens, hundreds of baguettes, and you know how to cut them to create that beautiful, like very like sharp border. It's called an ear on a baguette. So my advice is that you need to practice. I mean, and the thing about baguettes is a baguette is made with commercial yeast mostly. I mean, some places make it with sourdough starter, but it's easy enough to procure those ingredients. And again, if it doesn't turn out perfectly, you'll still have delicious bread, right? I mean, it's the biggest part about the baguette is what it looks like in the end. Of course, what it tastes like and the texture, but in the end, it has that particular signature look that's the hard part to achieve, and that's what takes the most practice.
And then my last question before the end of our event is, what is your favorite bread to eat and why?
Professor, you go first.
What was the question? I'm sorry, I froze. My favorite what?
What is your favorite bread to eat and why?
Oh my goodness. Well, my favorite food is toast. So I would just say a nice piece of bread toasted for till it's medium brown and a little bit of butter.
For me, it's like, you know, which one of your children is your favorite? It really depends on what. So like we were talking earlier about having a hamburger with a hamburger bun. At that case, the hamburger bun is my favorite bread. If I had to have it with a slice of sourdough, it's a bummer to me. Like I don't want to have a sourdough bread with my hamburger. So I'm sorry, it's a non-committal answer, but I cannot put panettone in the same room as brioche or baguettes, right? They all have a different purpose. So if the question is what bread could I eat every day, probably like a country sourdough bread, you know, something that has some rye in it and a little bit of whole wheat, but has a little bit of that sour taste. That's a bread that you can eat with savory foods. You can eat it with sweet foods. It's a very generous bread that lasts many days. So.
Well, that was our last question. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who attended our event and asked questions and had wonderful responses. And thank you for attending and being so, what is the word? Being so engaged with all of us tonight. We really appreciate it here at CSR, and our events are designed to get people into science and people seeing the connectedness in which science plays a role in almost all aspects of the world. And thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you, Chef Migoya. Thank you, Professor Elias. Your perspectives were amazing. Your responses were fantastic. I really appreciated learning from all of you, and I'm sure all of the attendees did as well. So thank you so much for everything.
That was really interesting. Thanks so much.
It was a great pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are enthusiastic about bread and just food in general. This doesn't feel like work at all ever. So it's a wonderful thing that you guys have set up, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate it. We couldn't have asked for better speakers. Thank you so much. And with that, we'll leave you.